Hello and welcome to this week's lecture. This week we will be talking about composition and organization. Composition and organization are what helps tie your work together. It's what helps to make your works feel finished or polished. For the most part, composition is how things are laid out on a page, right? So it's the reason why we put elements in the way that we put them on a page or an artwork or a piece. Composition is also the word for the piece as a whole. So I will try not to use them, both of them, but I have a really bad habit of talking about like compositional pieces, like pieces that make up composition and then the composition itself. So I will try to be sure to really emphasize which one I'm speaking about. So the first one of these I want to talk to you about is alignment. This one is going to be very brief because we've already talked a lot about it in the lecture on typography. So alignment is lining up elements either on like a side or top to bottom. So you have a left, center, right alignment. You have a top, middle, bottom alignment. And that's super important when laying out your type because we're trained to read a certain way and our eyes like certain like blocks, but it's also true of visual elements. So when you are putting together a piece, be aware of making sure things are aligned on some sort of axis. If you have everything aligned except for one thing and you're not doing that intentionally, you're creating a point of emphasis or a focal point where you don't mean one. And if it's done without intentionality, it can make your user like confused. It can also make your design muddy. And it can be one of those things where you look at something and you're just like, this is off. And I don't know why it's off. And in general, that is a really uncomfy feeling for a viewer. So, make sure that you are working with intentionality in terms of alignment of your designs. This is really, really important in web design as well. And it's one of the most difficult things to control because of the different screen sizes. I also want to point out in terms of alignment that in Western culture, so, Europe, US, those kind of cultures, we read left to right, top to bottom. This is not true of every culture, so be aware of your target audience again. But if you are designing for a Western or an American audience, you want to have your most important information, like the information or elements that you do not want your viewer to miss, in that entry point of your top left, right? That's why headlines are on the top of the page versus in the middle, because we read that top to bottom. All right, our next one is rhythm. So rhythm is just like how it is in music, right? So a piece of music has a rhythm or a time signature. A visual piece has a visual rhythm as well. So rhythm is the way that one of the ways that you create consistency throughout your pieces. So in this example here with the kayaks, we have a very regular rhythm. So I would say that's more of like a harmonious rhythm. You can have irregular rhythm. So the way that we create rhythm through here is through the repetition of elements and the intervals between them. So it's very, very similar to pattern, and we'll go over that in a little bit. But the rhythm is the way that it takes you through a piece, right? You have a very like regular rhythm that can make your piece feel very consistent and safe. You have an irregular rhythm that can make your piece feel more energetic. So what we have here is a more regular rhythm. And even though the kayaks are not all the same color, I don't even think necessarily they're all the same size, but the visual motif of the kayak through it creates that backdrop that unifies your piece together. All right, so next we're going to talk about contrast, and we've already talked about contrast in terms of hue or color. And we're going to talk about something that's close to contrast here in a little bit called emphasis. But contrast is the way that you create a focal point, which is a point of entry or a point of interest in your visual compositions. So composition as a whole. Using contrast lets us pick out one object from many, right? By comparing differences. So I want you to think of visual contrast in terms of contrasting colors or hues, contrasting shapes, contrasting sizes. In this one, it's a very explicit example of contrast because we have a differential in size, we have a differential in shape, and differential in color. You don't have to use all three, but the more that you use, the more that's going to pop. And that's because our eyes are really, really good at picking out differences. So if you're wanting to create that like one unique thing that the viewer will focus on, contrast is a good way to do that. All right, so let's talk about repetition and pattern now. So repetition and pattern may be used in rhythm. So you use repetition and pattern to create rhythm, right? They're separate pieces, but it is very uncommon to have one without the other. Because inherently, when you have repetition there, you are creating a rhythm in your piece. My computer made a noise. I don't know what it was. We're going to ignore it. So, again, repetition, pattern, those create consistency in your design. It's something that like brand identities use a lot. I want you to think of it in terms of things like newspaper, webpage hierarchy, stuff like that. We have these repeated elements, like our headings, our headlines, that create the same basic like layout from one page to another. And the reason that we do that is because it makes users feel safe. There's a really good book called Don't Make Me Think that is about how to create like user interfaces and web pages and stuff that are geared towards today's user. And one of the things that it goes over a lot in there is that users don't want to be surprised. They want to feel like they know what they're doing when they get on your web page. So you want to be consistent in your elements, your design, your menus. There's a reason that on mobile there are two types of menus. If you decided to create your own type of menu and somebody went in there and tried to use it, they're not going to come back, right? So repetition and pattern make the user feel safe because they feel like they know what's coming. All right, so let's talk about emphasis and tension. So emphasis is creating a focal point by putting things on a page and then positioning them to where they draw the eye. So where contrast is like a unique element among elements, think of the coffee beans and the green candy. Emphasis is amongst elements that are the same, creating a focal point by adjusting an element, right? So if you have many of the same thing, you can create emphasis by changing its position, changing its rotation, changing its size, stuff like that. Tension is it is a balance, but we're going to talk about balance more in a second. It is a balance between opposing items or elements. So there's this really cool art term called contrapposto, and it's seen in sculptures. And what it means is it's Italian. It means counterpoise. So it's used to describe a visual figure that is standing with its weight on one foot and the other foot lifted, almost like it's taking a step. So I want you to think of that when you think of tension, that visual, like literally tenseness that you have in your design, that you're like, oh, I want to see what's next, right? So you use that using opposing forces or elements. Your book chapter on tension has some really great examples of it, but it's another way to like create focal points and draw eyes through a work. All right, so our next one is balance. So I want you to think of balance in terms of a scale. So all of your visual, like all of your designs are going to have some sort of balance. We've talked about this before in the ways that we create this balance, right? So how do we do that? We do that through symmetry. We do that through visual weighting. It is the way that, one part of your design feels like it matches the other part of your design. It calms tension. So like in this example here, they're using symmetry to calm any visual tension and kind of grounds the design. And it's another technique again to make your user or your viewer feel more comfortable. When it comes to design work, in general, I find it that like you have two modes of design. And in non like creative work, and I use that in a very specific way, in non personal work, that's a better term for it. So in work that you're doing for a client, in marketing work, you are going to be using more balance than you are tension, because you want the person viewing it to buy in to whatever you're selling. Personal works and works that are more creative versus marketing, you can have that tension in there. But like, and there are uses for tension in marketing work. There are ways to create that like call to action of we want you to do this thing by using tension in there. But for the most part, you're wanting to create your tension and call to action through your words or through specifics, not through the overall design itself. Your overall design is going to need to feel balanced so that your messaging can get across. All right, our next one is movement. So movement is how the eye moves through a page. So think about our gestalt. Ow, sorry. I ended up stabbing myself with a paperclip. I should stop playing with it. All right. So it's how we move through an image, how our eye moves through it, how we take it in. And it comes back to that, and generally move top left to bottom right. Think of movement in terms of like video and photography. Think of it as that motion blur, right? So it's visual instability, so that it forces your eye to keep moving along a page or a design so that it doesn't just stay in one spot. All right, our next one is proportion. So, proportion is the relation of elements to each other, right? So, it can be in terms of magnitude, and for that, I want you to think of size. It can be in terms of quantity. So, how many of, thinking back to our earlier example with the coffee beans and the candy, the proportion of candy to coffee beans, or it can be degree. The goal is to create that sense of harmony or coherence within your design. There are some things that we have talked about before, again, going back to like balance and visual weighting and stuff like that. This is where our golden ratio comes in. So it is the Fibonacci sequence, the 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, on and on and on. In general, and you'll notice that I'm not speaking in a lot of specifics, and that's on purpose, and we'll talk about it at the end of the lecture. But things need to be in proportion to each other. So if you have one large element, you need to have a proportional amount of small elements to make your design feel coherent. If you have an element on the left side, but no element on the right side, it is not proportionally weighted, so it is not going to feel harmonious. It's also not going to necessarily feel coherent. So if things are out of proportion, your design, again, is not going to come off effectively, and your messaging behind it is going to get lost because your viewer is going to not, like instinctually almost, not pay attention to the messaging because they're distracted by the design. And that's not what we want. As a working artist, creating an art piece, that can be what you want. But as a advertiser or designer, your designs are very much a vehicle for messaging. And that's something that I really want to impress upon you all during this class, is that you can love your design, but your design is a vehicle for something else. A lot of times we as creative people get really, really attached to our designs, and that is okay, but know that design is an iterative process. So we're going to go through several of them, and especially if you're working with clients, you need to learn to separate yourself from your designs. Know that your worth as a designer and a human being is not dependent on whether or not someone likes your design. When I was going through art school, when we would do critiques, it was soul crushing, but it breaks you very easily of becoming like attached and enmeshed in your designs. So you are not your work. I just want you to remember that. Slight tangent and sidebar. All right. On to our next one. Organization. There are so many organizational schemes. However, we are doing a graphic design for web class. And in terms of websites, there is one organizational schema. So one way to organize things. And that way is a grid. I personally think that it has come out of, obviously it comes out of the history of websites being like a table structure. So like table, not like table that you put things on, table in terms like a data table. Back when the web came out, you had to build everything as a series of cells within a table. It also like harkens back to newspaper layouts. Newspaper layouts are grid based. So I want you all to learn to love the grid, because it is going to help you out. It can feel constricting, but as long as your stuff is laid out on a grid, It is always going to feel organized. So what is a grid? Well, think back to your math. A grid is a grouping of lines that work as a structure for putting things on, and that structure helps you build relationship between things. So in web design and in graphic design, a grid divides space into horizontal and vertical divisions. Give me just one moment. I apologize. So vertical and horizontal divisions, cells basically, and it is the bridge between all of these like compositional and organizational techniques and everything like that of your design, and converting it into a finished design. Okay. So I want to show you some grid types, and we'll kind of talk through the grid rationale as well. All right. So these are a lot of grid types, right? Some of these are going to seem familiar. Some of them are not. We're not going to go over all of them. And some of them are very print-based, and some of them are not. So the ones that I have down here are all print-based. So these are your layouts for like magazines, newspapers, that kind of thing. So we have a single column, which is just like one. Multi-column. So in that one, it's a 3-column layout. In web design, you have like most of your stuff is going to be like a 2-column, a 3-column, or a single column. We have a hang line or horizontal line grid. So that is just where you're doing it across the horizontals. We have a modular, which uses the just like the little cells as your grid. So in terms of these, think of your columns, rows, and cells. So modular is each cell, right? Columns is just using that up and down, that vertical. Hangline and baseline are just using that row, that horizontal. Hierarchical is your newspaper layout. So I want you to notice that on the top there is 1, and then there are 2 cells on the next one and 3 cells on the following. But that kind of creates that stair step to lead the eye down. The other ones are kind of cool. Look at them if you get a chance. We're not going to go over them. Axial, bilateral, radial, dilational, random, and transitional. Some of these are not even necessarily like square grids. They're pretty cool. But let's look at the meat and potatoes here. These are website specific ones. Okay? So I want you to kind of think of examples of each. So a block grid is going to be your traditional kind of layout, right? It is when you are on mobile, you are seeing a block grid. There is 1 column and things are stacked on top of each other. A column grid is what you're going to see on your laptops and desktops and stuff like that. It's where things are broken out. In general, you have like a 2x1. So that's kind of the blog look, where you have like, it's 3 columns, but the first 2 are a block of something, and then that third is your navigation or sidebar or other elements. Modular should feel very similar, or not similar, should feel familiar to you in terms of like galleries. So like a gallery of photos or a gallery of art. That's your modular, right? And then the last one is hierarchical. I have so much trouble with that word. which is again kind of like the blog layout, right? So you have your most important elements top left, so like your headers, stuff like that. You have your main content right below it, and then on the right you tend to have the less important content. Okay, so let's look at what actually makes up a grid now that we've seen what grids can be. And then this will be our last slide for the lecture. All right, so we have this here. If you need to see it bigger, please go look at the slides. So the margins are around the outside of the page or the grid itself. So if you think of your grid like a picture frame, the margins are the frame itself. So it is on the outside. It is that comfy space on the outside that separates your content out from other content. Okay? Flow lines are horizontal lines, like horizontal alignments that help guide your eye. So think about how on a web page you don't indent a paragraph, but you have a space between paragraphs. Those spaces between paragraphs or chunks of content are flow lines. So they assist in guiding your eye downwards. They also kind of give you a break in between content. Modules are also called cells. Those are the individual pieces in between your grid, creating your columns and rows. So on here, our actual grid here are these little rectangles, the little gray rectangles. I know that there is some larger squares that are made, but our actual grid are these little ones right here, right? So C is our module or our cell, and that is the individual unit of space. D is our columns. So those are going to be the vertical, so the up, down. And then E is more of a so an E is the spatial zone. Think of a spatial zone as a chunk, right? So we like to chunk out our content. And each chunk is a spatial zone. It is a group of modules or cells that forms a distinct thing. So every like group is going to be a spatial zone. So if you think about a web page, your image gallery is going to be a spatial zone. Your blog is going to be a spatial zone. Your social media post or social media widget is going to be a spatial zone. It is distinct things forming a group. Markers, these are graphic things for page information. So I want you to think of a marker like the hamburger or the 3 dots for your menus. It's any sort of like graphical shorthand that helps for page information. This comes from print. So you would have a marker on there for your margins, and then you would also have like your color bars. But in terms of web design, your markers are things that are the visual shorthand. So like your mobile menu buttons, your like when you 3 dots means there's more there. The little caret or the V knows that that's going to either open up or drop down or take you to somewhere else. They're just little visual things that your users are used to help them navigate and get more information about the page. And then the last thing is gutters or alleys. So gutters are just like flow lines but vertical. So they are the spaces between your spatial zones or between your columns, can be both, it can be either. Not neither. It's one or the other. But they give that little space so that your mind can breathe between content. I really, really want you guys, well, everyone, to remember when you are creating stuff that your brain needs space between items. Unless you are going for a very much like maximalist, just overwhelming overstimulation aesthetic, your brain needs components to be separated from one another for your users and your viewers to not get lost and to feel more comfortable using your stuff. So that is composition and organization. Have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you later. Thanks. Bye.